During the Summer War Games, a 3-day training exercise of the Russian Northern Fleet in the Barents Sea, the Kursk, an Oscar II-class nuclear-powered cruise missile submarine, disappeared. After a severely delayed search and rescue mission, the Russian Navy finally found her lying on the sea floor with a terrifying hole in her hull. The Russian rescuers thought they heard knocking and believed there were survivors. Though many foreign countries offered to help, the Russian Navy resisted. They were convinced that a foreign spy sub had collided with the Kursk and caused it to sink. Eventually, they had to admit that their equipment was faulty, and Russian President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin ordered them to allow Norwegian and British rescuers on the scene. They were too late. The Kursk had gone down with all hands. The press had mercilessly reported the Navy's incompetence and their constant lies and deception. They called President Putin heartless for not breaking off his vacation to support the rescue effort in the Barents Sea. Once the rescue operation was over, Putin launched a charm offensive to get control of the situation. He promised the families of the Kursk crew that he would recover the bodies and raise the Kursk. A little over 2 months after the accident, an international team of Halliburton divers joined Russian divers to retrieve the bodies. However, the damage inside the sub was so severe that they couldn't continue the work. They had retrieved 12 bodies. 106 were left behind. On 2 of the bodies, notes had been found. They revealed that 23 crewmen had survived at least 4 hours after the blast in compartment 9. The Americans consistently denied any involvement, and there were a lot of conspiracy theories about what caused the unsinkable Kursk to sink. For anyone to find out what had happened and to recover the bodies, the Kursk had to be salvaged. Never had anything as enormous as the Kursk been lifted from the sea floor, yet Putin had promised the families and all of Russia he would do everything in his power to make it happen. Deputy Prime Minister Ilya Klebanov had said no single country on its own can handle such an operation. And so, in January 2001, the governments of the Russian Federation and the Netherlands unveiled a plan to raise the Russian nuclear submarine and bring her to port. Families of the Kursk crew fear that raising the Kursk would cost even more lives. Investigators had 12 bodies, Kolesnikov's note, and hauled up a ton of wreckage. Why push their luck? Some wanted to respect the age-old naval tradition and leave the wreck and their victims undisturbed. Leave the Kursk where she lay, bury the reactors in cement, and place buoys to warn merchant vessels to steer clear of the site. 2 American and 4 Russian nuclear submarines were already on the bottom of the ocean. What was one more? Russian patriots were angry about the cost of this risky venture, ranging anywhere from $60 to $130 million. Putin should use the money elsewhere and not give it to some foreign salvage company. President Putin was like, "Nope, I'm a man of my word. The costs are justified," he said. One of the problems which arose in recent years in the country is this distrust of government officials. This confidence could only be restored if what we promise is fulfilled in the economy, in the finances, in the political sphere, everywhere. He had promised they would try to raise the Kursk. They would try to raise the Kursk. Who could actually lift the massive submarine off of the sea floor and transport it to a dry dock for investigation? Igor Spassky, the director of Rubin Central Design Bureau for Marine Engineering, the company that designed the Kursk, got the assignment and the money to find someone to get the job done. Over 500 companies from all over the world submitted their proposals. The frontrunner for the job was a syndicate of a Dutch company, Smit International, and Halliburton Subsea, a Norwegian subsidiary of the American Energy Services Company. However, Spassky did want to hear the plan from another Dutch company, Mammoet. Mammoet was a heavy lift and transportation company specialized in lifting massive objects. like the London Eye. The owners, the brothers Frans and Jan van Seumeren, had been thinking about raising the submarine ever since they heard about the Kursk disaster. They had only lifted things on land and never from the sea, but Frans felt that heavy lifting was in their wheelhouse and pushed his brother Jan to consider it. The biggest challenge was keeping the submarine level during the lifting process in such a rough sea. If the submarine was not raised in perfect balance, the lifting cables could break, and that would be a disaster. One night, Jan was sitting in the bathtub, and he figured out how it could be done. He took his ideas to the drawing board at the office the next day. From a barge that was held in place precisely above the Kursk by massive anchors, Mammoet would lower 26 cables with huge plugs that fit into 26 holes they'd cut in the Kursk's double hull. Once the jacks were deployed on the inside of the submarine, they would lift the whole thing off the floor, brace it in a cradle under the barge, and transport it to the harbor. To offset the waves and raise the sub evenly, Jan invented a unique system of 26 computer-controlled heave compensators that adjusted the tension on each lifting cable independently. Spassky liked the idea, but told Frans that he was too late. Smit-Halliburton had been given the job. Frans wasn't too disappointed. Lifting a submarine wasn't exactly their core business, and he continued with his regular projects. But then, in April, 3 months later, the phone rang. Spassky asked Frans to immediately come to St. Petersburg, in secret. The Smit-Halliburton syndicate had pulled out. The consortium refused to compromise the safety of its crew or the environment to meet the Russian deadline of raising the wreck in September 2001. They felt that the Russian government rushed the project purely for political reasons. Frans didn't think he should do it. The schedule was too tight, but after talking it over with his crew and subcontractor, they decided that it could be done. Frans knew he couldn't accept anything less than $50 million to do the job. Spassky had received $65 million, twice the annual budget for the entire Navy. He offered Mammoet $62.5 and kept the rest in reserve for unforeseen circumstances. The men shook on it, and the negotiation was over in all but 30 seconds. It was the fastest Frans had ever concluded a deal. The contract negotiations were rough. 8 people represented Mammoet, but the Russians showed up with 150 people to discuss all the details. Representatives from the Ministries of Internal Affairs, Foreign Affairs, Defense, the Navy, and anyone who had a remote interest in the project was there. It was pandemonium. Just when Frans thought he had one issue settled, someone from another department came and ripped the agreement up. The talks went on for days. The company's lawyer told them to just stop. But Frans felt they had come too far now to end the negotiations. The brothers understood that it was a tough decision for Spassky to make. Mammoet was a family company. It might be safer for him to choose the much larger syndicate of Smit-Halliburton. But Spassky assured the brothers that he had told Putin that if they wanted to raise the submarine, they'd have to go with Mammoet. But a few days on, they were getting nowhere, and Jan demanded to speak with Spassky in person. He tried to explain in the kindest, most reasonable way to wrap up the agreement already. Spassky asked Jan whether he was sure he could do it. Sure, but they had to hurry because they were running out of time. If they managed it, Spassky promised the brothers a statue in St. Petersburg, but if they failed, Spassky made a gun with his finger and put it against his head. Apparently, he was telling Mammoet, succeed or die. The contract was finally signed at the end of May 2001, and the race was on. 100 Mammoet employees were told that instead of spending the summer in the sunny Canary Islands, they were going to spend it in the Arctic Circle. They set the deadline to start lifting on the 21st of September at the latest. After that, storm season started, which typically lasted 6 months. As difficult as it was to raise the Kursk in the rough Barents Sea, it would be impossible to lift the sub in stormy weather. The system they needed would take about 18 months to build. They had 5, and they could only work with the materials that could be supplied at short notice. Technical universities were very skeptical of the plans, and the press was merciless. Were they nuts? There was no way they could do it. Interestingly, Mammoet involved Smith International in the operations, and Halliburton saturation divers would cut the holes for the plugs. There was no time to build a new ship. The brothers converted their own Giant 4, a 24,000-ton, 430-feet-long semi-submersible vessel. The crew removed a section in the middle of the barge to fit the submarine's conning tower, and technicians installed the custom-built heave compensators on top of 26 holes cut right through the vessel. Next, they tested, adjusted, and tested again all the various parts of the machinery needed for the job. On July 15, 2001, diving support vessel DSND Mayo from Aberdeen arrived in the Barents Sea. The Halliburton and the Russian divers started clearing the debris around the Kursk, flushing the built-up sand and silt from the boat, and cutting the 26 holes in the hulls with a high-pressure water-cutting device. Mammoet finished retrofitting the Giant 4 at the end of August, and she left the Amsterdam docks at 10 o'clock at night. Despite the late hour, thousands of people gathered to wave her off and applauded the Mammoet guys like heroes. The brothers felt proud of their impossible achievement, but also apprehension. Was this gonna work? The salvage operation faced two considerable risks. At any time during the operation, the torpedo warheads and missiles could detonate, or the twin nuclear reactors could begin to leak radiation, or both. Only 7 of the submarine's 24 torpedoes had been found, and all but 2 had conventional explosives. All had been in the forward compartment that no longer existed. 7 or so torpedoes probably exploded in the second blast, and torpedo pieces were found among the debris on the sea floor, but those didn't add up to the 15 missing torpedoes. Some might still be intact and hidden under the hull, under the shattered first compartment, or blown back into the second compartment. Spoilers, some torpedoes were found in the second compartment. At the time of the sinking, there were still 23 shipwreck cruise missiles on board. These P-700 Granite cruise missiles were among the most powerful conventional naval weapons in the world. Except for one, all were secure in their silos. They couldn't accidentally be launched because there was no power on the Kursk. But they could still detonate. Environmental agencies protested that this was a rush job bound to go wrong. They could set off the weapons just by sawing into the hull. The Russians should have used the money to dismantle the floating Chernobyls, the decommissioned nuclear subs rusting at docks all over the Kola Peninsula. At Mammoet's request, the Nuclear Coordinating Group did an extensive risk assessment analysis. They believed the reactors, the barge, and other service vessels would not be affected if up to 2 torpedoes blew up simultaneously during the salvage operation. The chances of them going off all at once were practically 0. The missiles were a different story. If even just one of them detonated, it would kill everyone in the vicinity of the Kursk, and the submarine would cease to exist. They ran many trials to see whether the equipment's shocks or vibrations could set off the missiles. They couldn't. The most significant risk was the Kursk's shattered bow section, which was so damaged that it could break off during the lifting process. No heave compensator in the world could compensate for that. It would destabilize the sub, snap some cables, and drop the Kursk back to the floor. The impact could destroy the nuclear reactors or set off the missiles. The team decided to cut off the bow and leave it on the sea floor. It could be lifted separately at a later date. All the conspiracy theorists were like, "We are right!" The pro-collision group, the anti-collision group, the friendly fire missile group, the Skval failure group all believed the Russians were intentionally leaving the bow on the floor to cover something up. At Putin's request, officials launched a website with daily updates on the raising effort to shut them all up. This way, the Russians created the news and would not become the news. The site also included updates on the two investigations conducted by Deputy Prime Minister Ilya Klebanov and General Prosecutor Vladimir Ustinov. Deputy Prime Minister was Team Collision and National Prosecutor was Team Skeptic. He had yet to see evidence of a foreign sub's involvement. In complete contrast with last year, 1,200 reporters from 27 countries were given credentials to cover the entire lifting process. The Halliburton divers worked in 6-hour shifts, but right away they hit a snag. Parts of the work, which were supposed to be carried out by robots, had to be done by hand. The space between the hulls was filled with pipes, air pressure canisters, and support beams, and the divers had to stop multiple times because of bad weather. On August 12, 2001, to commemorate the first anniversary of the Kursk accident, they lay wreaths and held a memorial service at the submarine's crew home port of Vijayeva. 3 weeks before the September 21st deadline, the hulls were cut, and Mahmud lowered the sawing unit to the bottom of the sea to cut off the Kursk's bow. First, the divers carefully removed any torpedoes lying along the cutting line. The sawing device consisted of 2 large hydraulic anchors clamped to the sea floor on either side of the Kursk, pulling a high-strength carbide saw back and forth between them across the bow. It was working, but after cutting 2 meters into the hull, the unit's cable broke. The whole installation had to be hauled up to replace the cable, then be lowered and installed again. This happened 2 more times. 6 days later, the bow was sawn entirely off. Divers sealed the front end of the wreck with a thick metal sheet to prevent more water from entering during the lifting, which could destabilize the operation. The salvage crew now raised several smaller pieces of wreckage for analysis. Among them was part of a torpedo tube, a compressed air cylinder, and a fragment of the sonar system dome to determine the nature of the explosions and the fire. Time was running out. Russian meteorologists said cyclones were expected in the Barents Sea any day now. The press mocked the mission. People everywhere started protesting the dangers of the operation, and Russian officials began increasing pressure on the company. Franz himself went out to the Barents Sea to join his brother Jan and supervise the operation. They were 10 days behind and a month away from the dreaded winter season when the Giant 4 arrived on location to deploy the cables and the plugs. The Mahmud's crew family and friends back home lit candles on little homemade altars to send good vibes the crew's way, but the September 21st deadline came and went. It was October. The 328-feet-long hoisting cables and the grippers turned out to be a pain to install. It took forever to fix the first 3 plugs in place, especially the 3rd plug just wouldn't deploy. Franz made a quick calculation. If every plug took this much time to install, they couldn't start lifting until mid-November. Franz went into a little Russian Orthodox church to say a quick prayer. The crew learned fast, and to everyone's relief, installed the remaining 23 plugs in the same amount of time it had taken them to deploy the first 3. Everything was ready to go. But storm season was upon them. The waves were coming hard and fast. They couldn't start lifting if the swells were higher than 8 feet. And if the seas were calm, but the weather deteriorated during the lift, then they would have to lower the Kursk back to the sea floor. All they needed were 3 clear days to get the job done. It was one of the toughest moments for the brothers. Jan went outside, looked up at the heavens, and said, "Everyone in the whole world has done everything they could to get this far. Make it happen." The next day, the weather was beautiful. The forecast was good. There was even a rainbow. Jan called it a gift from heaven. Perhaps those altars back home and his brother's little prayer had helped. Safety engineers gave the green light on October 7th. Despite most of them not having slept properly for days, everyone rushed to their stations. They were going to lift the Kursk. The moment of truth had arrived. Could the Kursk even be lifted? The sub was laying in the mud, a silty clay. How much suction would there be on the hull? Mahmud had calculated a suction or hold-down force of between 0 and 11,000 tons. To break whatever force there was, they had to apply a disproportionately high lift tension to initiate the lift. But the hull shouldn't bend in the process, because that could rupture it, bust the nuclear reactor's chamber, and disaster. They had a backup plan. 2 tugs could pull a steel cable under the Kursk keel from bow to stern in a seesaw motion. This was risky. They could detonate any torpedo wedged under the hull, or, if the cable broke, it could whip against one of the missile silos with such a force that it set off a shipwreck missile. On the opposite end of the suction problem was no suction at all. Then the Kursk could slip sideways on the tidal stream, dragging everything with her, even breaking the cables. At 4 a.m., the team got started and hoped for the best. Deputy Chief of the Northern Fleet, Vice Admiral Michael Matzak, spat over his right shoulder 3 times for good luck. Jan just said, "Let's get started." The whole machine was set in motion. The 26 hoisting cables strained. The forces exerted on the giant 4 made it pound, creak, and squeal. The Kursk began to move, and she came free off the floor. For a moment it seemed as if the bow hadn't been completely cut off the sub, but to everyone's relief it remained on the floor. Air bubbles rising from the submarine indicated the Kursk was coming up. The lift was remarkably smooth at an average ascent rate of 32 feet per hour. 15 hours later, the sub fit snugly under the giant. 14 months after the disaster, and only 5 months after they'd been contracted, Mahmud's salvage team raised the Kursk. The salvage was a stunning technical achievement, the heaviest object ever lifted from such a depth, and the first nuclear submarine ever to be salvaged. Though there was a strict no-alcohol policy on the entire project, Spassky broke out a secret stash of vodka to celebrate with the brothers. At 8 p.m., the Kursk was clamped tight in the hull saddles under the giant 4. In this position, just below the waves and out of view from the outside world, tugboats carefully towed the barge and the submarine toward the massive dry dock in Rezlyalkova, just outside Murmansk, going 2.5 miles an hour. 8 Russian ships passed over the site with crews standing at attention and ships sounding sirens. Divers placed a marble tombstone by the bow section. The area remained closed for security reasons. Navigation and fishing were prohibited in the area. The Russian Navy still worried that foreign intelligence agencies would want to check out the bow fragments. But the project was not in the clear yet. If during this phase the weather changed, the upper casing hull of the Kursk could pound against the saddles and something could break. If this happened, the team had 2 choices. They would either make for sheltered waters, or the Kursk would have to be lowered to the sea floor until the seas were calm again. The storms did pick up again, just as the giant arrived in the Navy's shipyard in Murmansk. Phew, that was close. As it turned out, the next 3 consecutive days of good weather wouldn't happen until April next year. Franz said, "She was pulled away from the gates of hell, as it were." When the colossal giant 4 and her grave cargo approached the bay, the crowd gathered on the shore saw a small escort of dolphins leaping alongside the victorious convoy. All foghorns sounded at once. The mission so few had believed in was a resounding success. In the harbor, the operation entered the final phase. The Kursk had to be removed from under the giant. 2 massive, custom-built pontoons called Mar and Gon, named after Franz and Jan's wives, were filled with water to lower them under the giant 4. They were then pumped full of air to lift the barge 66 feet up so she could enter the floating dry dock with the Kursk attached underneath. Water would fill the pontoons again to lower both vessels until the Kursk rested in the support cradle of the dry dock. They would detach the plugs and cables, and air would be pumped into the pontoons one last time, so the giant could leave the dry dock. Even though the water around the wreck was checked for radiation 24/7 and found to be clear all the way, locals feared a nuclear fallout. The nuclear reactors could have destabilized during transit, and the missiles might still detonate and destroy the dreaded fifth compartment that housed the reactors in the process. The schools in the neighborhood did emergency drills. Razaljakiva officials prepared evacuation plans and stockpiled medical supplies. To appease the locals, a screen showing current radiation readouts was placed in the center of the town. The operation to bring the Kursk into dock hit an unexpected technical snag. The pontoons, pumping, and draining devices didn't work correctly, and the locks didn't fit. They brought in equipment to fix the issues. The operation was no longer dependent on weather conditions, so there was no need to rush. The operation was completed 5 days later, on October 23rd, when the Giant 4 exited the dock and left the Kursk behind. The brothers' job was done. They held a small ceremony with the crew and threw a wreath into the dry dock. 2 months later, during a special ceremony with President Putin, Franz and Jan were awarded the Friends for Life medal. They never got their statue. The dry dock was surrounded by 3 layers of security. The bayside exposure of the sub was shrouded in camouflage. After the water in the dock was tested for radiation, it was very slowly pumped out over the course of 3 days to make sure the evidence would stay in place. After a moment of silence to honor the dead, the first person to step on top of the Kursk was Gleb Lyachin, the son of Captain Gennady Lyachin, late commander of the submarine. 2 days later, the Kursk was drained entirely, revealing the devastation in all its horror. The submarine's interior was a tangled mess of twisted and melted metal. Ustinov told Russian television that the site defied description. It is a very, very, very remarkable sight. Now, the first Russian investigators entered the Kursk. The forensic investigators needed to retrieve the bodies as quickly as possible. The cold waters of the Barents Sea had preserved the bodies, but exposed to air, they would deteriorate quickly. No one knew how many crew members would be found. Many may have simply vaporized in the explosion. The investigators wore heavy protective suits and gas masks. There might be toxic fumes that had built up during her time underwater, and perhaps radiation. They would work in the Kursk for half an hour, and then go outside for another half hour to recover from what they saw inside. The most emotionally stable investigators had been selected, and they had received special training to handle the hellscape they were gonna work in. More than a few couldn't hack it and had to walk away from the chambers of horror. By Friday, 12 bodies were recovered. They were in remarkable condition. One had already been identified, Alexei Stankiewicz, a medical service captain. A small hole was drilled in the 5th compartment to measure radiation levels and determine if it was safe to enter. It was. Specialists went into the compartment to further secure the reactors. November 5th, 2001. Time had come to remove the missiles. Always a dangerous job. If they detonated in the shipyard, a good part of the town would be obliterated. Luckily, the silos were not damaged. Oh, never mind, they were. Some of the forward silos had been twisted during the explosions. They removed 5 missiles smoothly when suddenly an evacuation alarm rang out. The investigators had stumbled across 150 kilograms of TNT from a torpedo warhead that had been blown into the 2nd compartment. The investigators would work in the daytime from now on, and they would not make any sudden moves. The first funerals after the Kursk was raised were held in St. Petersburg on November 17th. Many more ceremonies would follow as more and more bodies were recovered. It appeared that some sailors had managed to move from the forward compartments to aft between the explosions. At the end of the month, investigators found a farewell letter written by Chief Warrant Officer Andrei Borisov. It was addressed to his family and sealed in an empty water bottle. The message was personal and contained no information about what happened to the Kursk. Its contents were not made public at this time. 17 missiles were recovered without problems. The remaining 6, stuck in the deformed silos near the bow, would be dismantled along with the sub at a naval scrapyard. At the end of November, the Prosecutor General laid a report on the President's desk. It was written by Vice Admiral Valery Ryazantsev of the Pacific Fleet. Ryazantsev had joined the Government Commission as an independent expert and had conducted his own investigation. No one had asked him to, but he had written a scathing report about the careless behavior of the Northern Fleet commanders. The commanders had committed a disturbing range of safety violations regarding the ill-fated summer war games, along with related breaches of rescue protocols. Senior officers unjustifiably delayed reports of trouble, and the rescue assets proved woefully inadequate for the mission. Ustinov told Putin that there was no evidence at all to support the popular collision claims. The Navy audaciously lied to him about the cause of the submarine disaster. The President was livid. 3 hours later, Putin signed the order to dismiss 17 admirals and senior officers of the Northern Fleet and Naval Command for dereliction in the organization of military readiness. There was no mention of the Kursk, though. Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, Admiral Vladimir Kuryedov, was protected by his friendship with Putin, but everyone else was in the firing line, especially those who had kept pushing the collision theory. It was a purge not seen in decades. Kuryedov announced the 3 most prominent demotions on national television. Northern Fleet Chief Admiral Vyacheslav Popov and Northern Fleet Chief of Staff Vice Admiral Mikhail Matsak were demoted. The Fleet Submarine Flotilla Commander Vice Admiral Oleg Birtsev was sacked. Others were sacked and received other disciplinary sanctions. Navy Rescue Chief Rear Admiral Gennady Virich and Northern Fleet Rescue Chief Alexander Teslenko were among them. Newspapers called the men mere scapegoats so the government would be off the hook. Why was Kuryedov even left in charge? He had approved the entire exercise plan and then overseen its political fallout. The Northern Fleet and the Navy Search and Rescue Department in Moscow were hella mad. For years the Navy had been criminally underfunded. For years they had begged for money. How was this their fault? Some well-respected officers petitioned to reinstate the admirals. Only 3 were reinstated. Vice Admiral Birtsev was one of them. The families were baffled. This was Russia at its finest. It was all bureaucratic self-preservation and no accountability or justice for the Kursk families. Because most of the officers demoted or dismissed got cushy government jobs. Some admirals like Popov and Matsak went into politics. In January 2002, the Russian authorities officially acknowledged that the sinking of the Kursk was not caused by a collision with a foreign vessel. Klebanov finally admitted that the accident had been caused because of the deterioration of the Russian armed forces in the 1990s. The exact cause of the accident would be known later this year. Klebanov's commission of inquiry had yielded nothing, and his insistence on the collision theory made his position indefensible. Klebanov's head was next on the chopping block, although... Klebanov made a sideways promotion and became the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology, and then went on to become a presidential envoy. He was not personally responsible for the Navy's errors. Throughout the winter, a steady stream of recovered bodies was announced. Even when they thought there would be no more crew members, they found them. The families' vigils were long and painful. In the end, nearly 100 officers and sailors were removed from the Kursk. All but 6 had been identified. All the bodies were severely burned, but most of them had drowned. Fittingly, the last recovery from the salvaged submarine was the Kursk commanding officer, Captain Gennady Lichin. In a final grand ceremony a week later, on March 23, 2002, Lichin was buried in the Hero's Way in St. Petersburg along with 7 others. A small memorial was built to honor the 3 who would never have a grave. 32 crew members were buried in St. Petersburg, while others were laid to rest in cemeteries closer to their families. Sometimes the decision on where to bury the sailors led to fights between the widows and parents. Should they be interred in their hometowns or thousands of miles away where the widows now lived in apartments given to them by the government? Fights also broke out about how to divide the vast sums of money that the widows were paid. Other unexpected problems arose concerning the payout. A lot of family members were shunned by their neighbors, badgered for money, or pushed out of jobs since they wouldn't need a paycheck anymore. It was as though they had won the lottery. One mother said, "I never thought people would be jealous of me because my son died on the Kursk." In April, the Kursk's forward section was sealed and she made her final journey to Nerpa Naval Shipyard to be broken up and sold for scrap metal. It would take 3 months to dismantle her. The cruise missiles were dismantled and broken up for spares. Part of the conning tower, including the emblem of the two-headed eagle, would become a memorial in honor of the crew in the city of Kursk. A month later, after a 2-week delay because of fierce winds and high seas, Russian salvage ships began a final expedition to recover the remaining fragments of the Kursk submarine from the bottom of the Barents Sea. For instance, they lifted a large fragment of the Kursk's nose section. The Navy blew up whatever pieces the government considered irrelevant to the investigation. The conspiracy theorists were like, "Told ya." General Prosecutor Ustinov's final report emerged in July 2002. 1,500 experts conducted 2,000 investigations, interviewed 1,200 witnesses, performed 211 forensic examinations, and examined 8,000 objects, 200 of which were material evidence. 1,000 customized experiments contributed to the conclusions. It all resulted in a 100-page final report. In a minute-by-minute account, Ustinov explained that the Kursk was sunk by the detonation of her own torpedo, which did not even have a warhead. The 6576 PV, the whale practice torpedo, aka the Fat Girl, was in the 4th tube, the lower port bank, when it leaked HTP oxidizer through the micro cracks in the oxidizer casing. When the highly volatile fuel contacted certain metal elements inside the torpedo firing device, it immediately decomposed. The oxidizer tank and the firing tube exploded with a force of 50,000 atmospheres and blew a hole through both the inner and outer hulls right outside the launch tube. It started a fire. Metal fragments shot through the torpedo room, puncturing fuel tanks and igniting warhead materials. Over the next 2 minutes and 15 seconds, the fire reached temperatures as high as 5,400 degrees Fahrenheit. The submarine crashed on the sea floor 76 seconds later. After another 59 seconds, at least 4 combat torpedoes reached their maximum heat threshold and detonated. All the sailors forward of the reactors died within a few minutes. The 23 men found in the 9th compartment died within 8 hours. No rescue effort in the world could have saved any of them. Though the exercise was poorly planned and executed, no individuals behaved criminally. There were no guilty parties. The full report contained too many state secrets and couldn't be completely disclosed to the public. It is said that the 33-volume report would remain classified for 25 years. The world should be able to see it in 2027. The Russian Navy finally recognized the hazard of the HTP-fueled torpedoes and ordered all of them to be removed from service. Since the report was published, quite a few experts have weighed in on its conclusions. A lot of investigators and journalists wrote books, contradicting each other like a bunch of Northern Fleet admirals. Most importantly, Vice Admiral Ryazantsev of the Pacific Fleet, the guy who wrote the report that got everybody fired, wrote a blistering tell-all about what really sank the Kursk. He said Ustinov's investigation team wasn't independent nor impartial. Most believe it had no intention to determine the cause of the explosion, it just had to find the culprit without a name and a surname. Those interviewed were given instructions on how to answer, and they never even talked to the manufacturers of that supposedly defective whale torpedo, the Getty Research Institute. If they had interviewed the torpedo manufacturers, they would have known that their conclusions were based on fantasy. It was simple for them. Because of poor quality welds in the oxidizer tank, the oxidizer leaked for a while, then caused an explosion, a fire, more explosions, and the death of a nuclear submarine. It happened. Bad luck, old chum. Moving on. According to the whale manufacturers, the weapons could only have exploded after an external event like a fire. In a torpedo tube, there was nothing to burn. There was no lubrication inside the tube, and it was painted with non-combustible paint. Because, duh. The torpedo's paint, a few microns thick, was not firewood and not gasoline. Oh, and the weapon was ready to launch, so the torpedo launch tube was filled with water. And the torpedo compartment itself had a powerful fire extinguishing system that would have dumped tons of water and put out any fire. Despite what many had claimed in the media, no one on board had been worried about the torpedo, not the crew, not the captain. The condition of the oxidizer was fine for over a week after loading. Despite not having run tests or having been given a chance to investigate further, Ryazantsev believes that the crew probably repressurized the whale, like one would repressurize a tire. The torpedo leaked tiny amounts of high-pressure air, not an emergency. The procedure was simple and straightforward. The crew used a special hose and degreased equipment, but according to the documentation, the equipment hadn't been degreased for a long while, and the air hose was likely filled with oil, dirt, dust, and grease. The crew repressurized the whale with unfiltered air. This in itself is not an issue because there were safety valves. However, one particular valve, the trigger valve, was finicky. It could be slightly raised. According to the manual of the torpedo, the crew had to check the position of the valve before loading it into the tube. The manual aboard the Kursk miraculously survived the explosion. However, it was for a multi-purpose submarine of a different class. This model sub didn't have a trigger valve issue, so the manual didn't mention this step of the loading procedure. In all those years, no one had ever needed the manual because they had never launched the whale before. In all those years, no one ever checked to make sure it was the correct manual. But even with the whale torpedo exploding exactly the way it happened, it would have been fine. Only the forward compartment would have flooded because all the compartments were sealed off with watertight doors during firing. The torpedo crew would probably have died, but everyone else would have been fine. However, because of a design error, firing torpedoes in the forward compartment raised the pressure inside the room. To prevent the torpedo crew from rupturing their eardrums, they needed to keep the ventilation valves to the second compartment open when firing a single torpedo. Even with the valves open, firing 2 torpedoes at the same time was impossible. Why the designers even thought to put the command post right next to the torpedo compartment is still a mystery. Ryazantsev's findings were ignored. Ustinov's investigation did not mention that the leading cause of the Kursk destruction was the structural shortcomings of peroxide torpedoes, period. They didn't mention the staff across the board committed violation after violation of standard operating procedures, rules, and obligations that endangered the lives of the entire fleet. They didn't mention that the very design of the nuclear submarine set it up for a catastrophic failure. If we consider all this, the following probably happened on that fateful day, August 12, 2000. Keep in mind, not everyone agrees on the following order of events. The Kursk was at battle stations for the practice launch of one 65-76 PV practice torpedo and one USET-80 torpedo with an experimental new battery. All the watertight compartments on the boat were shut. A fundamental design flaw in the submarine required for the bulkhead ventilation valves between the first and second compartments to remain open to equalize pressure during firing. Sometime between 9 and 10 in the morning, the crew loaded the repressurized whale torpedo into torpedo tube 4, lower bank port side, without realizing that they needed to check that the trigger air valve was in the closed position. Dirty air now began to slowly flow into the launch cylinder, raising the pressure. The starting cylinder was not equipped with a pressure relief valve, so the pressure built and built. At 11:20, Captain Lichin ordered to prepare the launch. Water filled the launch tube. By 11 hours and 28 minutes, the pressure inside the oxidizer starting cylinder reached a critical point. The oxidizer launch balloon exploded with the power of 5 to 7 kilograms of TNT. This local explosion destroyed the launch kerosene cylinder, and the dirt and dust mixed with the HTP in the oxidizer tank and rapidly decomposed. At 11 hours, 28 minutes and 26 seconds, the HTP, the kerosene in the fuel tank and the air tank exploded with a pressure of 200 kilograms per square centimeter. The force took off the torpedo tube's outer door and the 800-pound breech door, along with the launch tube's back end. The pressure shock killed the crew in the torpedo room mercifully quick. It reshaped the compartment's interior, but it was stopped by the second bulkhead, which held. However, the shock wave carried on through the open bulkhead ventilation valves. It tore through the second compartment, throwing men from their posts, smashing them against the machinery and pipework. The 36 men in the control room were either killed or knocked unconscious. At the very least, their eardrums were ruptured. The Peter the Great sonar trace showed continuing activity following the initial explosion spike. They believed it was a severe fire and jetting of the torpedo propellant system into the compartment. But it was more likely the seawater pouring in at a rate of about 11 cubic feet per second through the busted fourth torpedo tube. It would fill the forward compartment in mere minutes. And if only that bulkhead valve hadn't been opened. The detonation traveled along the pipes into the rest of the sub. All aboard knew a failed torpedo launch. They grabbed their emergency suits and masks. Water from the forward compartment started to pour into the second compartment through the open bulkhead ventilation valves. Either the built-in safety features of the nuclear reactor modules automatically activated after the blast, or one of the two crewmen in compartment 5B hit the kill switch to shut them down. Either way, the control rods were driven safely home in time. The atomic activity stopped, the buildup of steam stopped, the pressure dropped, and the turbines slowed down. The huge twin propellers spun to a halt. The submarine veered off course and, dead in the water, began to drift. The flooding caused negative buoyancy, and from a periscope depth, she began to slowly sink. CCP controllers were unable to correct the drop, and the sub nosedived. Sailors in the aft section slid forwards, tumbling over each other, slamming into the bulkheads, hitting everything along the way, levers, furniture, and ladders. Lichin had seconds, not minutes, to save the submarine. They were only in 377 feet of water. He had to blow and go. With one push of the button, the compressed air would blow water out of the ballast tank and shoot the Kursk straight to the surface. No one pressed it. There was probably no one alive to press it. Those in the third compartment could hit the backup kill switch, but no one was allowed to use it unless the captain ordered it. No one was giving the order. No one had considered a scenario where the central command post was disabled. The main command post was disabled, and no one in the third compartment threw the kill switch. Another minute later, the first compartment was almost completely filled with water, and the downward angle of the sub was about 35 degrees. It was another 80 feet to the bottom of the Barents. Some of the third and fourth compartment sailors and officers moved aft. Others lined up at the escape pod, dressed in emergency escape suits and wearing masks. After 15 seconds, the K-141 hit the ground at a 42-degree angle at a speed of about 3 knots. The impact collapsed the bow and the torpedo tubes. 1/5 of a second later, about 7 fully armed torpedo rounds in the wreck detonated. Then the submarine rolled to the left, leaning over 65 degrees, scraping along the bottom, scooping up mud and more water in the forward sections of the sub. This rolling along the seafloor caused dents and scrapes on the starboard side. After scraping along the bottom for about 100 feet, the Kursk stopped, nearly upright. The nuclear generator was stopped. The batteries at the bottom of the forward compartment were destroyed. The sub was powered down. The force of the exploding arsenal was monstrous and tore apart the solid inner hull and the outer hull of the Kursk. The starboard dome of the torpedo room blew out, leaving a gaping hole of 10 square feet directly above the torpedo storage area. The shockwave raised the first compartment's bulkhead, which collapsed into the second and squashed the third compartment, the decks, the equipment, and most of the crew along with it into one twisted pile of metal. One of the sailors in the command center was blown backward and upwards with such a force that his body was found embedded in the ceiling of the second compartment. The steel bulkhead that separated the control room from the third compartment was ripped open as if it were made of paper. The fourth compartment's partition collapsed, and the roaring water rushing into the sub wrecked the kitchen, the canteen, and many of the living and crew's sleeping quarters and all the interior walls. Sailors were hit by machinery from the first and second compartment that had been yanked right off their sockets and were blown all the way back to the fourth compartment. The shockwaves destroyed bulkhead after bulkhead until it reached the fifth compartment, housing the twin nuclear reactors. The forward bulkhead bulged, buckled, and twisted, but held. The world had come within 5 inches of steel of a second Chernobyl. The bulkhead was designed for this kind of impact. However, it was a miracle that the granite shipwreck missiles hadn't gone off when the Kursk hit the ground or when the torpedoes exploded. Any one of those missiles could have blown the entire sub and the reactor with it to smithereens. Those forward of compartment 5 died quickly. Those behind the reactors were about to enter the 9th circle of hell. The crew in each compartment probably used the emergency intercom to check in with each other. Only those in compartments 6, 7, 8, and 9 responded. They couldn't get a hold of anyone in the forward compartments. Perhaps the man forward of the reactor got out. The primary escape route from a downed Oscar II submarine was from an escape pod in the second compartment. The secondary escape route was through the torpedo tubes. Third way out was an escape hatch in the 9th compartment. A rescue vessel could seal itself to the docking ring above the upper hatch and extract survivors, or they could put on their emergency escape suits and leave the sub through the escape tower one by one. Captain Lieutenant Rashid Aryapov was in charge of 5 sailors in the 6th compartment. Aryapov's friends, the captain lieutenants Dmitry Kolesnikov and Sergei Sadolyenko, were in charge of the 16 men handling the main engines and turbo generators in the 7th and 8th compartments. There were 3 mechanics in the final compartment, the 9th. While awaiting orders, they probably did what they were trained to do. They remained in their sealed compartments and secured valves and flappers to reduce the flooding. Since they couldn't move forward of the reactor compartment to get to the escape pod or use the torpedo tubes, their only way out was through the 3rd escape route, the compartment 9 escape hatch. At some point, they decided that everyone should make their way to the cramped 9th compartment. At the same time, Aryapov and a fellow crewman apparently checked on the 6th compartment bulkhead to verify that the reactors had automatically shut down and to guarantee their stability. If the rods were not shoved into their fully inserted positions, water wouldn't cool the reactors, and they would have gotten even hotter. In no time, the fuel would melt through the reactor, dropping a highly radioactive lump on the sea floor that would poison the ocean. Using the reactor control manuals, Aryapov configured the system to prevent an imminent temperature spike. Doing this, he ensured the regional waters would not be contaminated by a nuclear leak. Everyone gathered all the emergency supplies, personal rescue equipment, the B-64 emergency air regeneration cartridges, food and water, and brought it into the 9th. The Kursk survivors faced 4 immediate problems, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: falling oxygen levels and rising carbon dioxide levels by merely breathing, plummeting temperatures, flooding, and the rising pressure. All 4 were life-threatening. The men didn't opt for using the escape hatch at this time. They may have thought that because the Kursk sank in shallow waters near the main base in front of the entire Northern Fleet Command, that rescuers would be on them soon, use the emergency buoy that deployed on impact to talk to them, and they'd take it from there. They had enough air regeneration reserves to last a day, plenty of time for rescuers to get them out, or to attach air hoses and electricity to the 9th compartment. Operating the hatch was a lot of heavy work. They better save oxygen and wait. But they didn't know that the emergency buoy hadn't deployed. Northern Fleet specialists claimed that the Kursk buoy had malfunctioned so many times that it had been welded down. Some said that the Kursk officers had disconnected the buoy sensors during their deployment in the Mediterranean because they were afraid it would release accidentally and give away their position, and that they had forgotten to plug it back in. Others suggested that the sensors had been destroyed by the explosion before they could trigger the buoy's release. None of that was true. The buoy still had the safety straps on from when it was installed. During all the Kursk's years in service, no one had noticed that the straps hadn't been removed after the installation. Exactly 2 hours and 6 minutes after the first explosion, Kolesnikov tore out a blank page from one of the submarine's notebooks and with a blue pen wrote down the date and time, 1:34 p.m. Kolesnikov then wrote down 23 names, 1 per line, listing them in order by compartment and rank. Behind each name he drew a little check mark indicating that each was present and accounted for after the evacuatia, the evacuation. When he was done, he wrote the time, 1:58 p.m. It had taken him 24 minutes to do the roll call. That someone could write so neatly 2 hours after the explosion is a remarkable feat for a 27-year-old officer. 2 people who should have been aft were not on the list. 2 specialists on the propulsion system, Alexei Belanov and Alexei Machayev, must have moved forward during the torpedo launch. Kolesnikov listed Dmitry Leonov from the 2nd compartment, who might have come aft to run an errand for the captain. Kolesnikov held a roll call at regular intervals to gauge the level of consciousness from the strength of the crew members' response. He also wrote the note to his wife on the top of the back of the page. Alichka, I love you. Don't suffer too much. My regards to Giveya and regards to mine, Mitya. 23 sailors were waiting for help from their commanders. No one in the Russian fleet even knew there was a problem yet. Andrei Borisov wrote a farewell note to his wife and son and sealed it inside a water bottle. My dear Natasha and Sasha, if you are reading this letter, it means I am no longer with you. Natasha, Sasha, I love you so very much. But your lives will carry on, and I'm asking that my son becomes a true man, like I used to be. A.M. Borisov. Written underneath, we did everything according to the instructions. The crew knew they were in trouble. Sadolyenko tore a page from a detective novel to write a note. Klebanov later paraphrased the letter to the public. He said that the crew felt terrible because of the carbon dioxide and that the pressure was rising. They couldn't survive decompression and wouldn't last another day. This is what Sadolyenko wrote. In 9th compartment, 23 people. We feel bad. Weakened by CO. Fighting for survival. The pressure in the compartment is 0.6 kilograms per square centimeter. B64 ends. We cannot survive compression when we reach the surface. Not enough IDA straps. There are no carbine hooks on the stopper, the halyard. It is necessary to secure the buoy. Damper. We will last no more than a day. Sadolyenko wrapped it in plastic and put it away. There had been no sign of rescuers for the last 3 hours. The situation in the compartment got worse. All batteries died. It was pitch black. The temperature dropped to about 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius. The air quality was getting worse, not just from the carbon dioxide, but from the evaporation of industrial oil and diesel fuel that now floated on top of the water. The men had to feel their way around the compartment. The physical and psychological condition of many submariners worsened. Some of them laid down in bunks to preserve energy and oxygen. They knew they would not last the day. They knew that as the water leaked in, the pressure was rising in their compartment. They knew they were nearly saturated and running out of time for a free ascent to the surface, where they would almost certainly die from decompression sickness. They knew not all of them could make it. Not everyone had a reserve oxygen canister or escape suit. But they had to do something. Anything was better than just waiting to die. They couldn't risk a submariner in the rescue chamber losing consciousness and be stuck, blocking their way out. Their only option was not to just flood the escape tower, but the entire 9th compartment to equalize the pressure and open the hatch. Before attempting to do this, Kolesnikov wrote his next note on the back of the roll call in complete darkness. Kolesnikov's first note had been written neatly following the lines on the paper. These 4 sentences were all over the page and difficult to read. He didn't write down the time. Perhaps he could no longer read his watch. It's dark to write here, but I'll try by feel. It looks like there are no chances, 10-20%. Let's hope that at least someone will read this. Here is the list of personnel from the other sections who are now in the 9th and will attempt to get out. Regards to everybody. No need to despair. Kolesnikov. It was hard physical labor to prepare the escape hatch. They had to open the bottom hatch, install a shutoff ladder and a tube, press and lock the latch of the top hatch, prepare their air supply, prepare a buoy and a flooding system for the compartment. But they had to do this in complete darkness, in a physically and morally weakened state with precious little oxygen. So, they needed more oxygen. They started opening more and more packages to purify as much air as they could and drastically increase oxygen so they could do the work. Sometime later, after Kolesnikov wrote his final note in the dark, the submariners began to increase the oxygen in the 9th compartment. The water had nearly reached their waists, and they had to move around the space by feel and hang the plates in a safe place free from oil and water. Someone unpacked a B-64 regeneration plate and dropped it in the oily water. The cartridge ignited. In the sealed high-pressure environment, a flash fire shot across the surface of the water. Some of the sailors ducked below the water. A few seconds later, the fire used up all the oxygen and went out. The fire had reacted with the paintwork and the metal inside the 9th compartment and produced lethal quantities of carbon monoxide. Those underwater came up for air, but the air could no longer support life. The oxygen was gone. After 1 or 2 breaths of the carbon monoxide-filled air, they passed out and slipped into the great good night. The Kursk refuge was pitch black. Empty air regeneration cartridges lay at the feet of the submariners beneath several feet of water. Unopened B-64 packages floated on the surface. 15 of the 80 water bottles were emptied. Near the body of one submariner lay a complete set of instructions for the emergency escape hatch. Some of the sailors were reclined, as if asleep. Kolesnikov was slumped below the escape trunk, his head and upper body severely burned from his proximity to the initial flare-up. Others stood close to the spot where the cartridge was dropped. They were found with thermal burns consistent with a violent chemical reaction. Sadylyenko was in a top bunk and severely burnt. Aryapov lay in a bunk below the water, an oxygen mask clamped tightly to his face. One of his pockets contained a short letter written by his friend in the upper bunk, Sadylyenko. The 23 men had faced the hazards of carbon dioxide poisoning, hypothermia, and drowning. However, they had all died from carbon monoxide poisoning. We're not exactly sure when the men died. Kolesnikov's third and final note had no time written next to it. Initially, the fleet commanders declared that the crew members had survived for between 18 and 24 hours. This was adjusted to 8 hours. This timeline was politically convenient. After all, not even a superbly executed search and rescue effort would have reached the 9th hatch on the first day. Some forensic scientists believe the large number of opened oxygen regeneration cartridges used up by the survivors suggested that they lived for quite some time beyond the first day. But it was more likely that they opened a bunch of them to quickly restore enough oxygen in preparation for leaving. We will never know whether the Kursk sailors were alive in the 9th compartment on Sunday, the 13th of August, when Misuk scraped over the escape hatch, or on Thursday, when Sholokhov came so frustratingly close to docking. But by the time the Seaway Eagle and the Normand Pioneer specialist arrived on the scene 8 days after the accident, the 23 men were almost certainly dead. They could have been saved. But the fleet was woefully unprepared, their rescue plan non-existent, their equipment incompatible, and their attitude and mindset all wrong. No one was really satisfied with Ustinov's explanations. Hardcore collision believers, friendly missile theorists, Skval debacle supporters, American torpedo advocates all talked about a cover-up. Relatives of the Kursk crew members were shocked, so no one was directly to blame for the accident, and the men in the 9th compartment had died within 8 hours? Top officials kept insisting that knocking was heard, at least until Monday, August 14th. No, that's nothing but mechanical noise. They called this report the final betrayal. The guilty should be punished. Relatives of the Kursk crew members fought hard throughout the second half of 2002 to have the probe reopened. 30 months after the disaster, the military prosecutor rejected the relatives' request for reopening the investigation. It had been done really well. Case closed. The family members decided to take it to court. In 2002, Putin admitted he had made a blunder by staying in Sochi. He said, "I probably should have returned to Moscow, but nothing would have changed. I had the same level of communication both in Sochi and in Moscow. Still, from a PR point of view, I could have demonstrated some special eagerness to return." But he appeared to smirk on CNN's Larry King when asked what happened to the Kursk, and he replied, "It sank." Speaking of blunders, in March 2009, Russian journalist Tatyana Abramova of Murmansky Vestnik found the conning tower of the Kursk submarine in a Murmansk scrapyard, rusting in the snow. The Navy had not been able to raise the $22,000 for a memorial and ditched it. Apparently, the Kremlin wanted to forget the Kursk. The local community was outraged. They demanded the sail be restored and turned into a Kursk memorial. The admirals of the fleet realized they had made a mistake, and with great difficulty collected the money needed to restore the conning tower. The memorial was revealed on Russia's Navy Day in 2009. It was dedicated to the submariners who died in peacetime and lists the names of all 118 lost souls of the Kursk. A few years later, in 2012, divers representing the relatives of the Kursk crew and Northern Fleet Command placed an Orthodox cross on the floor of the Barents Sea at the site of the disaster. 55 family members of the dead seamen enlisted the help of well-known attorney Boris Kuznetsov. He won the right to get full access to the 33 volumes of the investigation. After this, Kuznetsov filed a legal complaint to reopen the inquiry about survival times and the fleet's rescue response. A military court rejected every single one of his claims in April 2004. Roman Kolesnikov, Dmitry Kolesnikov's father, took his negligence claims to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. The case was accepted, and after a hearing, the court upheld the complaint. There would be a final ruling. But then Kolesnikov's father withdrew the complaint. No one knows why, not even Kuznetsov. That meant no court, including Strasbourg, would take the case up again. From a legal point of view, the Kursk case was closed. The lawyer Kuznetsov was forced to flee the country in 2007 to escape persecution for another case. He was granted asylum in the US, and he described the response to the disaster as Putin's first lie. In the same European Court of Human Rights, the newspaper Novaya Gazeta won a legal battle against the Russian Defense Ministry for its right to continue to probe the Kursk accident. The weekly news journal Novaya Gazeta backed the Kursk relatives by condemning the authorities for carrying out a criminal investigation that found no one was to blame. Their own investigation had uncovered that plenty of naval officers had been criminally negligent and should be brought to court. In another investigation, the paper disputed the conclusion of a naval forensic expert, Viktor Kulkutin, that the 23 sailors had died 8 hours after the explosions. Novaya Gazeta alleged that the sailors had survived longer than that and that the Navy had bungled the rescue attempt. Northern Fleet officers should be taken to court. The newspaper was taken to court instead for defamation. They were fined 57,000 rubles, about $1,000, by a Moscow court in 2005. So 12 years later, the European Court ruled that by persecuting the journalists, the Russian Defense Ministry had violated Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which safeguards freedom of expression. The newspaper, one of the last bastions of independent reporting in Russia, had been vindicated. But it was a hollow victory. The European Court was applauding and supporting what no longer existed in Russia: a free press that could question the military's version of events and hold the Kremlin to account. Looking back 20 years after the tragedy, there is a distinct before and after the Kursk in President Putin's political legacy. He learned his lessons well, really well.